In this video, we're going to move beyond representations of women in art and representations of women as scandalous or virtuous, and actually think about some women who we know their biographies, who we know they were very productive artists and also patrons. So the beginning of this video will look at a number of women who were quite successful as artists. They did face a number of challenges, but they also had some successes. And then we'll look at two patrons at the end of the video. So this one's called Women as Artists and Patrons, Renaissance Exemplars, because we'll mostly be thinking of Renaissance Italy. Our first example is a really extraordinary woman named Properzia de Rossi, who lived for about 40 years from 1490 to 1530 in Renaissance Italy. She was from Bologna, and the city of Bologna is very proud to have her as someone who came from their city. She was well educated. The University of Bologna actually educated women, so Bologna was a wonderful city to be from if you wanted to become an artist. She also trained in drawing with Marcantonio Raimondi, who later became one of the most important printmakers of the time. She's most well known for this carving in marble, so this sculpture, which is called Joseph and Potiphar's Wife. It was created for the Basilica of San Petronio in Bologna, so for a main church on a main piazza in her home city. And so receiving this commission to create narratives and also to create angels and other decorative features, this was a big commission, an important commission for her. It does seem that some of the other artists may have said bad things about her, and that she wasn't properly paid for her work, but this was something that a lot of women artists struggled with. It's very important that she was working in marble, that she was a sculptor, because we do not see a lot of women who worked in this medium. Sculpting is somewhat of a dirty trade or dirty artistic skill, in the sense that you're going to have a lot of marble dust, your clothes are going to get dirty. So it wasn't necessarily associated with a lot of women who were supposed to be home and keeping clean and being proper. So painting was generally more acceptable than sculpture for women. The subject here, as I said, is Joseph and Potiphar's wife. It's a story from the Old Testament. It's a story of a woman who was the wife of an Egyptian officer who was trying to seduce Joseph. He, of course, is rejecting her seduction as this holy individual, but she does grab his jacket, and so his jacket gets left behind, or his cloak gets left behind, which makes him appear guilty. In this particular scene, you see Properzia's understanding of classical antiquity, what she's seen of classical sculpture. She understands how to represent hanging drapery. She understands how to represent anatomy. We can see how Potiphar's wife is trying to seduce Joseph. Her clothing is starting to come off. We can see her breasts, and so it's a very seductive scene. Later on, it was also read that or it was also believed that Properzia kind of had an unrequited love, and that this reflected this idea of a man who had rejected her, who didn't feel the same way about her. But we doubt that that's necessarily true, and it may just be something that was read into it later because there was such an accurate kind of passion in this particular scene. If we look at another representation of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, it was a very popular subject or very popular iconography in the Renaissance. And so here we see a representation by an artist named Tintoretto, who worked primarily in Venice. And you can see again that same narrative where there's a nude or semi-nude woman who's trying to keep Joseph there and ends up grabbing his cloak in the process. And it's always this very kind of seductive bedroom scene. So it would be something that was very alluring to the Renaissance viewer. Properzia is quite famous for being one of the few women who is discussed by an important art historian named Giorgio Vasari. You can see his name spelled right here. He's one of the reasons we know so much about artists from the Italian Renaissance, but he did write a biography. You can see it here, Vita de Propiedad de Rossi, sculptor from Bologna. And so she did receive this praise from Giorgio Vasari, and it's from Giorgio Vasari that we know about her commissions in Bologna, or what she was able to receive in order to the commissions she was able to get in Bologna, even though she wasn't that well paid for them. She also was well known for carving the pits of fruit, or what are sometimes called stones. So here's a carved cherry stone pendant, and it actually has a number of very, very tiny little portrait heads on it. So just this idea that although she did carve in marble, as we saw with Joseph and Potiphar's wife, when she first started, really was restricted to unusual materials like the stones of fruit, like cherries and peaches and things like that. So that's something that shows how women were somewhat disadvantaged in the sense that they had to use the materials that they had. And in this case, she's using fruit stones. Also, just the idea that women carving in more miniature styles may have been more acceptable. So this idea of carving in really, really small scale, perhaps that was a more acceptable way for a woman to become an artist. One of the most important artists of the Renaissance is Sofonisba Anguissola. She came from a noble family, and that's how she was able to receive her artistic training. Her father encouraged Sofonisba and her sisters. She was one of 7 children, and he encouraged them to become trained in a number of skills, so music and art and painting. And Sofonisba did train with artists in more private instruction. She didn't receive the kind of typical studio apprenticeship that a typical male artist would receive. So she did come from this upper class family, but her father seems to have wanted the daughters to be well trained in a variety of skills and to have some professional lives to a certain extent. Here we see a wonderful painting by Sofonisba called Three Sisters Playing Chess. The sisters are usually identified as Lucia, Europa, and Minerva, along with their governess or nurse or babysitter who's nearby. Obviously, they're engaged in a very intellectual game. You actually are seeing the moment where the sister, who we presume is Lucia, is winning the game, the other sister is reacting, and this younger sister is kind of laughing at what's happening. You can see the great interest in detail and what Sofonisba is able to achieve in terms of representing this kind of highly decorated carpet that decorates the table, the amazing dress, the brocaded dress and detailed jewelry that the sisters are wearing, the elaborate hairstyles. So this kind of interest in these details is something where Sofonisba is really showing off her skill. She was also well known for representing her family with a particular lifelike quality. Obviously, these were people she knew very well, so she was able to represent them with a wonderful kind of sense of humor in some ways, and also a great intimacy, of course, when it's one's own family. There was a long tradition of men being represented playing chess. Here I'm showing you a number of paintings from different time periods. And so obviously Sofonisba is making a kind of statement where she's saying women can play chess too, women can be educated too. So there's also a message here in that sense. I wanted to show you a quick view of Cremona. This is the city where Sofonisba is from. It's in northern Italy. So we talked about how Properzia was from Bologna. That's a city kind of closer to Florence in central Italy. Cremona is farther into the north, but it is a city of humanists, musicians, and artists that really did encourage creativity. Here's a drawing that I know is in pretty rough shape. It's by Sofonisba, but it's very important in the sense that it was sent to Michelangelo. It was a gift to Michelangelo. So there was this exchange of letters between Michelangelo and Sofonisba's father, because it seems that he was trying to get Michelangelo to really recognize the talent of Sofonisba. Michelangelo requested a drawing by Sofonisba of a boy weeping, which is supposed to be a challenging subject. How is she going to represent a figure weeping, and how is the expression going to look? So here you see a young boy who's Sofonisba's brother, who's just been bitten by a crayfish, kind of this trick that a sister has played on him. And again, you're seeing this wonderful, lifelike, living quality because it is this intimate moment between siblings, between family members. And so Sofonisba had this great understanding of her siblings. And this drawing was appreciated by Michelangelo and was, I think, eventually given to the Duke of Florence, Cosimo I. Here's a quote from one of those letters. So Sofonisba's father sent a letter to Michelangelo thanking him for being kind enough to examine, judge, and praise the paintings done by my daughter Sofonisba. And it was really important that her father was encouraging her to paint and working on her behalf, because Sofonisba really couldn't have done it on her own because she was a woman. And here, just very quickly, we're seeing a self-portrait. She was very interested in self-portraits. Self-portraits will become important for female artists because this idea of It was very unusual for a woman to paint, so a lot of people wanted to collect these types of paintings later on as they become more popular, because if you had something like this on your wall, it would be really striking. You'd say, oh, this is by a woman. Isn't that unusual? Sofonisba represents herself in very stylish but simple black garb. We see her working on a very devout but very sweet image of the Virgin and Child, which was often a kind of bread and butter image, an image that you could make a good amount of money on if you were an artist. But there's a lovely intimacy here, but obviously a focus on devotion and chastity that would be appropriate for a female artist. She's also showing herself in the act of painting, so she's not rejecting the idea that she is a painter, that she does work with her hands, which was something that some artists shied away from. They didn't want to represent that actual act of painting, but here Sofonisba is, of course, doing that. I wanted to compare The Boy Bitten by a Crayfish with a painting by Caravaggio, which may have been influenced in some way. So we see Caravaggio, a very important later Baroque painter, where you see a lizard biting a boy and the kind of expression and reaction from that boy. And so Sofonisba's may have been influential to a certain extent on this very significant Baroque artist, Caravaggio. Another painting by Sofonisba is Bernardino Campi, painting a portrait of Sofonisba Anguissola. Bernardino Campi was one of her instructors from whom she received this private training. You can see that Bernardino is essentially creating an image of Sofonisba here. And so Sofonisba is maybe giving him credit for creating her as an artist, or giving him credit for creating her partially as an artist. And maybe she trained with other individuals as well, so she received creation from other artists too. But she may be giving credit to her teacher, but she also is perhaps indicating that she's even better than her teacher now. So for example, she's larger than him in this painting. She takes up much more space. She's dressed in a much more kind of vivid red brocaded garment. Also, people have pointed out that Bernardino looks much more real than Sofonisba. So this idea of her style is even more naturalistic than Sofonisba's, or than Bernardino's style. So her style is more naturalistic than what he is painting. Some people have also suggested the fact that he has a maul stick here to steady his hand is kind of an insult, that he needs that assistance to steady what he's, to steady his hand to paint. But Sofonisba herself represented her painting where she's also using a maul stick, which we saw here. So it's not particularly unusual. There's also this unusual connection of hands. So this idea of she has a hand here, but also this idea of her perhaps guiding his hand. So there have been different interpretations of this double hand too. And there's a whole question of who's the artist and who's the model here, who's being active and who's being passive. So in the image, she looks like she's the model, she looks like she's the one being painted, but the reality is she's the one who painted this entire image. So it's very striking in that sense. Here's another self-portrait where we see Sofonisba properly accompanied by a chaperone, which would be expected by women of all types around this time. Again, she's wearing a very beautiful but simple garment. You again, also with this chaperone, you have this contrast between young and old. So a lot of times women would do this where you would highlight a woman's youth by comparing her to an older woman. So there's kind of this dramatic play between the very pale, smooth skin, round face of Sofonisba to the more angular, more tanned and slightly wrinkled skin of this older woman. Sofonisba here is playing a musical instrument rather than in the act of painting, and often women artists would do this as a way of showing off their skill rather than in the act of painting itself. They're kind of saying, look at all the things I can do, including the fact that I have musical accomplishment. Sofonisba later on went to join the court in Spain, the court of Philip IV, and she was also a lady in waiting. She received like a stipend for doing this and later on a pension, but she really never sold any of her paintings because she was from this upper class noble family. It would be considered inappropriate for her to try to make money from her paintings, and so she really would give them away more as gifts. So here we're seeing a portrait of Philip I and also Isabel, or sometimes goes by Elizabeth of Valois. and this was Philip's third wife. And then here is a portrait by Sofonisba of Queen Anne of Austria. Again, you can see that typical kind of black garb that was very common in the Counter-Reformation. So this time when there was great Catholic devotion and great austerity. You can see lovely details, however, as you look at that collar that Queen Anne of Austria is wearing. So this was the fourth wife of Philip II. And so that kind of undulating collar and the wonderful details of the lace, even with that very austere garment, Sofonisba Anguissola is still enjoying some of those details. Sofonisba Anguissola lived a very long life. Here we see a self-portrait when she was in her 70s, and later a great Baroque portrait painter named Sir Anthony van Dyck went to visit her and painted her just before her death when she was in her 90s in 1624. So a really impressive career of Sofonisba Anguissola. Another significant artist is Diana Scultori, sometimes called Ghisi or Mantovani. She comes from a city called Mantua. And here we see a print that she created the plate for. So she created the source of what would be used to print this image from. It's called Christ and the Woman Taken in Adultery. It dates to the latter part of the 16th century from late Renaissance Italy. So we see Christ here with a woman who was identified as an adulterer. And you have men who predominantly are Pharisees who have brought her to Christ, knowing that Christ usually forgives those who sin. And he's saying, or they're bringing her to him and basically saying, well, what are you going to do with her? This is a woman who we've caught in adultery. And he basically responds, he that is without sin, cast the first stone, because they're asking him to stone her, to encourage others to stone her. And he's basically saying, you know, all of you are sinners, and so none of you can do that act, can basically say that you are completely free from sin. They are placed within a temple space that is probably supposed to be reminiscent of Solomon's temple. These kind of undulating columns were thought to be linked to the tradition of Solomon's temple. So Diana Scultori is trying to link back to that older tradition. She spent a great deal of time in Rome, so she would have been familiar with ancient Roman styles, so they're familiar with things like temple pediments, columns or pilasters, that interest in geometric forms, circular temples. She would have seen all these types of things in the area of Rome. So here I'm just comparing the print that we just saw and answering the question, how did she become an artist? She was the child of a sculptor and an engraver. She also married an architect, and she spent a great deal of time in Rome, and she got to know a lot of the artists in Rome and a lot of the printmakers and worked well with them. Moving on to Lavinia Fontana, she was also well known for self-portraits, kind of similar to Sofonisba Anguissola. This one includes an inscription in the upper left-hand corner that says, Lavinia, the unmarried daughter of Prospero Fontana, took her image from the mirror in 1577. So this idea that the mirror was often a source of one self-portrait, of course. Here we see her, like Sofonisba, playing a musical instrument, but we're reminded that she's also an artist. She was the daughter of a painter, so Prospero Fontana was a painter, and he was quite successful, and Lavinia was his only daughter, his only child, and so she became the one who was trained by her father. So that's how she became an artist. Her father was an artist. So this one's called Self-Portrait at a Spinet with a Servant. She was quite successful. This is a case of a very large altarpiece that was commissioned from Lavinia Fontana. Receiving these large public commissions was an important way of saying that she was a very accepted artist at this time. This is called the Consecration to the Virgin. It was originally for a chapel in a church in Bologna. So she was from Bologna, again, that city that if you were a woman artist, it was a really good place to be from because women were generally more educated there. So you see this glorification of the Virgin, praised by angels and saints that surround her. We see Saint Helena here, who was the one who discovered the true cross. We see small children here, probably from the family that commissioned this artwork. And then you also see this idea of consecration or blessing happening here. And you also see the giving of a palm frond and a key to these two individuals, possibly indicating a path for holy holy things. So the palm is usually connected to martyrdom, and the key is usually connected to St. Peter. But a very grand and very substantial altarpiece. So she created portraits, religious iconography, and also some nudes, which was quite unusual for women. So we have a portrait of a noblewoman, a quite beautiful portrait. You can see the elaborate dress as well as the small dog that accompanies her. You can also see Lavinia Fontana. This is Judith with the head of Holofernes, a story that we've seen in a previous video that was known as a story of an Old Testament heroine. And then here we see the goddess Minerva getting dressed. And so this was probably a pretty exciting painting to be done by a female artist. She also created a portrait of a member of a family that was well known for being covered in hair. They had some kind of genetic issue, and they were members of different royal courts. And so Lavinia saw one of the daughters named Antonietta Gonzalez, and so she painted her portrait, who we see here. So she was known to be covered completely with hair, with the exception of basically her nose and her mouth, which we can see here. And the letter she's holding basically identifies the court that she and her family have been associated with. But many people have talked about how female artists were seen as almost freaks because they were unusual in the sense that they were creating art. And so that Lavinia herself is creating this kind of, or creating a portrait of this very freakish in some way young woman. So there's an interesting connection there. Lavinia also was invited to come to Rome. She was invited by the Pope, Clement VIII, and so she had this strong connection to a very powerful figure in Rome. Her father worked in Rome as well, so that's probably where she received the recommendation. Here we see Lavinia wearing her cross and also accompanied by in kind of a cabinet of curiosities or antique sculptures. And she looks like she's about to draw, but it also looks like she could be writing a letter. So she looks rather intellectual in this particular case. She was also a wife and mother of 11 children. And so in that sense, it's important to note that her husband did a lot of the work at home because Lavinia was really successful as a painter. Our last female artist is Marietta Robusti, who was the daughter of Tintoretto, who I showed you a painting by him closer to the beginning. Tintoretto, as I said, was from Venice, and he was a very prolific painter. He was an excellent painter. His paintings are known for this kind of loose, fast brushwork. He created wonderful portraits, and his favorite daughter was a woman named Marietta, and this is a portrait that is attributed to her. We don't know if it's by her 100%, but it shows some of the same characteristics as her father, Tintoretto, that kind of loose brushwork, that interest in different expressions. Here we're seeing a contrast of an older man and a younger boy. Again, that kind of contrast to highlight the kind of different ages of these two individuals. It's against a dark background. You can see a prominent chair upon which the older man is resting, the kind of fringe coming from the chair, and then the young boy standing nearby looking a bit more full of life. If we compare it to a work by her father, Tintoretto, so the name Tintoretto just means dyer, so it's more of a nickname for the family, and so sometimes she was called Tintoretta because she was obviously the female version, but again, you can see some similarities, and Tintoretto was well known for being able to execute these portraits quickly and really get to the character of these figures quickly, and Marietta may have had that same skill. Very quickly, just to show you a self-portrait by Marietta, again by a musical instrument, very common for women artists at this time. As we've already seen from Sofonisba, we saw it with Lavinia, and now we're seeing it again with Marietta Robusti. So this kind of continuity during the 16th century. So I'd like to talk about two patrons, the first one being Isabella DEste. Isabella d'Este was a very acquisitive patron. She was the Marchesa of a relatively small territory called Mantua. That's actually where Diana Scultori was from. So it was a very cultural center, a lot of art there, but it was very small. And so she didn't have a huge budget, but she did the best she could, and she was a very learned patron. So here we see Isabella with her kind of loose hair. We see her identified as the Marchesa of Mantua. We also see that this is basically a gold medal that was commissioned by an artist named Cristoforo Romano, so a male artist. but it's encased in jewels. And so this was actually a very special medal that Isabella kept for herself. So this kind of identifying portrait medal. She had other versions created in bronze that she gave out to her favorites, and people who received it were said to be very, very pleased. So this was something that a lot of Renaissance individuals would do in the upper classes. It was mostly men, but we do see some women. And so Isabella obviously felt it was important enough for her to have her own portrait medal. She was very interested in antiquities, so this kind of portrait medal connects back to traditions of coinage from ancient Rome, so she may have enjoyed that connection. Here we see Isabella in a very idealized portrait where she's represented in black. She was actually quite old by the time this portrait was created, but the artist has glossed over all of that. She had paintings often representing Athena, also Minerva, Minerva, and also other mythological stories. She had plates that represented scenes from mythology as well. And then she also had sculptures that almost looked like replicas from antiquity. So she was very interested in antique culture, which was somewhat unusual for women patrons at the time. So patron just means someone who's buying art rather than an artist who would be creating art. Our final patron of the day is Elizabeth I of England. So to leave Italy for a little while and look at the kind of portraits that were created of Elizabeth I. One of the most famous portraits of Elizabeth I is the Armada portrait, which we are seeing one version of the Armada portrait here. It's this portrait where Elizabeth really fills the composition. Her body really takes over the center portion and fills up the space. And you have this horizontal orientation. And so she's really filling up that horizontal orientation. Her hand rests on a globe, specifically on North America, to identify that England has these territories there and that the English Empire is growing. We see a crown indicating that she is the monarch of England. She was only the second female monarch of England, and so it was very important to mark that too. It's called the Armada portrait because this was to commemorate her victory over the Spanish Armada. And so the Spanish Armada had come to invade England. There was kind of a religious belief behind it because the Spanish had remained Catholic and the English had turned to Protestantism. Also, there was this idea of, finally trying to control England. And so the Spanish Armada, which was known to be the most accomplished of ships, decided to come and invade England. But unfortunately, unfortunately for Spain, the weather turns and you can see the horrible winds that they were said to encounter. So that is important to note as well. So just that kind of dramatic shift between one window and the other. You can see that in England, there's less understanding of perspective than there is in Italy, or there's just a different approach to it. To look at her body a little bit, you can see this dramatic, this puffed sleeves, and that she's just dripping with pearls. She was known as a virgin queen. She never married. And so this particular allusion to her virginity, there's a massive pearl down in her groin area. She also has that kind of large lace collar, which we saw previously with Anne of Austria. And so that's significant as well. There's this important speech that she gives when they're about to encounter the Spanish. And so she gives this speech at Tilbury where she says, "I know I have the body but a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and a king of England too." So there is this important idea that she knows she's a woman, she acknowledges she's a woman, and she doesn't try to convince people that women are incredibly strong. She tries to basically say that she can do things as well as a king can. So she acknowledges this idea that women were classified as weaker beings at this time. One more thing, this particular figure is usually associated with the kind of figures you'd see on the prow of a ship. So this idea of defeating the Spanish Armada or the Spanish ships. And some people think she's kind of turned her back on this figure. So some people think it symbolizes like a female enemy like Mary, Queen of Scots. So that's another possibility. Or the type of sirens upon the sea, mythological sirens that lead men into trouble. Just a few more portraits of Elizabeth as comparison. Here we see her as a princess looking very devout, probably with an Old Testament and a New Testament, and then the marker of the cross on her chest. And this is about 10 years after her mother had been beheaded. So her mother was Anne Boleyn, who was one of the wives of Henry VIII. And then another image where we see the pelican portrait, where again, she's kind of dripping with jewels and pearls, and particularly a pelican, which is shown plucking its own breast to give blood to its young. So a pelican was said to make this sacrifice for its young, that if its young were starving, it would basically use its beak to pierce its own breast and give that as nourishment to its children. So you can see that pelican piercing its breast with the young pelicans drinking, and that's where it is. And then also she has these kind of cherries on her ears, which again allude to this idea of her being a virgin queen. So quite aggressive in the way it's reminding us of her virginity. We also have the Tudor rose and also the fleur-de-lis, reminding us that Elizabeth believed she had claims not only to England, but also to France. The fleur-de-lis was connected to France. So very unusual, highly decorative portraits that we see from Elizabeth I. So that was our discussion of a couple important Renaissance artists and two important Renaissance patrons.